This is 7th Generation Warfare, and I am your current host, John Nelson. In this episode, we'll be continuing to look at Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication number 1, Warfighting. And in this one, we are looking at physical, moral, and mental forces. War is characterized by the interaction of physical, moral, and mental forces. In a previous episode, I defined the will. If you've been watching this warfighting series, you know that war is a violent clash of wills. But in one of my other videos, I defined what I thought will was, and I defined will as the combination of one's desires, which could be seen as a mental force, what you want, what you can think of, one's abilities, which could be seen as a physical force, what you're actually capable of doing, because it's not really your will if you can think of it, but you have no realistic way of obtaining it, and one's conscience, what one's conscience tells them, is also part of your will, and that would be the moral force. So I like this, that war is characterized by the interaction of physical, moral, and mental forces. Works well with our definition. The physical characteristics of war are generally easily seen, understood, and measured. Equipment, capabilities, supplies, physical objects, sized, force ratios, losses of material or life, terrain lost or gained, prisoners or material captured. So your abilities, because the physical is one's own abilities, and one's abilities might actually not be that easy to measure. I think as you become more honest with yourself, which is part of 6th generation warfare, not trying to deceive yourself. As you become more honest with yourself, you'll better understand what your capabilities are. But to the average person, I don't know. I think there's a lot of people in society who delude themselves on their capabilities. I don't know. The moral characteristics are less tangible. The term moral is used here is not restricted to ethics, although ethics are certainly included, but pertains to those forces of psychological rather than tangible nature. Moral forces are difficult to grasp and impossible to quantify. You cannot easily gauge forces like national and military resolve, national or individual conscience, emotion, fear, courage, morale, leadership, or esprit. Yeah, but I think in terms of 6th and 7th generation warfare, one's conscience might be a little bit easier to grasp than a general trying to grasp the resolve of an entire country to go to war. Certainly, when you're trying to control others, you can't possibly understand what the voice inside their head, their conscience, is telling them to do or not to do, and so that becomes a huge problem for conventional war. But in 6th and 7th generation warfare, I mean, you live with yourself all the time, so I think it's far easier. Back to the capabilities. Back to the physical aspect we were just talking about. I was saying it might be hard to assess what one's capabilities actually are, but I want to make sure I point to the other side of that coin. Is you might think you can't do something, but you might actually just be lacking confidence, and so you have to have high confidence too, because you don't want to sell yourself short. You don't really know if you're capable of something unless you give it an honest go. So have confidence, but come to learn what your limits are. And last, war also involves a significant mental or intellectual component. Mental forces provide the ability to grasp complex battlefield situations, to make effective estimates, calculations, and decisions, to devise tactics and strategies, and to develop plans. Well, developing plans sounds a lot like figuring out what one desires, right? If you have the desire to get a promotion, then that's something you can start to plan and start to think about whether you have the ability and whether or not you have to sell your conscience out to get that promotion. Will tell you whether or not that promotion is actually part of your will. But all that is in would be more of the mental forces of thinking up, setting the battlefield conditions mentally, seeing what theorize what the enemy might do, in seventh generation war, trying to think how your family, what your lessons you want to share with your family are, but then try to envision how they might fuck it up. How they might hear it and hear it differently from what the intent you were trying to share was, and how they might want to just discard it, or how it will not resonate with them because they didn't have the same experiences with you. All that is going to fall into that mental, intellectual component. Although material factors are more easily quantified, the moral and mental forces exert greater influence on the nature and outcome of war. Yeah, I mean, yeah, certainly in conventional war with the and in sixth and seventh generation war as well. It really comes down to one's resolve. This is not to lessen the importance of physical forces, for the physical forces in war can have significant impact on others. For example, the greatest effect of fires is generally not the amount of physical destruction they cause, but the effect of the physical destruction on the enemy's moral strength. Right. So you get into a firefight, and you don't necessarily have to kill a whole lot of the enemy to get them to go away. You just need to break their morale, to break their courage to stay and fight. And so that's why combined arms can be very helpful, because 1 second they think they're just fighting rifle versus rifle, and then all of a sudden very big booms start happening from artillery or aircraft, and it takes a sense of controllability out of the enemy's hands because if you're in a firefight, there's some level of control as to cover and concealment, and ducking and cover, and who you're firing at, whether you're flanking, what you're doing. But when big bombs start getting dropped from miles away, it's complete randomness whether or not you get turned to pink mist. So focus on the mental and ethical or moral aspects of things. Because it is difficult to come to grips with the moral and mental forces, it is tempting to exclude them from our study of war. However, any doctrine or theory of war that neglects these factors ignores the greatest part of the nature of war. Yeah. Yeah, and I think you can go back to watch, I think it's called Seasonality of Families, is the episode I did about how families go through the cycles. I tied it to the seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter. And a lot of that is driven by the moral forces that the moral and mental, the values and the beliefs that the people have in the family will determine whether in that generation, and or you can't really determine ultimately what the next generation does because they have their own will, but you can definitely start a trend heading to a much better or much darker place for your family. And so keeping that moral force high, some people might use religion. Religion is not something I will be using, and it's a very big concern of mine that I can't necessarily determine where my conscience ultimately came from, and that's something I'm working to figure out. How much of my conscience was taught to me, and how much is ingrained or natural or intuitive to me as a person, and if it is intuitive to me, will it be intuitive to my children in the same way? Now, I personally feel that that the conscience is a not collectively, individually, it's a universal force that everyone kind of has a conscience, but how that conscience speaks to people, I can't really know, and that's but you can't neglect it either. It's completely necessary for the purposes of fighting a 7th generation warfare. And yeah, so I hope I can figure that out. I hope that I can. I think a lot of the things I'm doing here with 7th generation war will encourage my kids to take the long, hard looks at themselves the way that I think I am taking long, hard looks at myself, if not only for their own benefit, but for the benefit of their children. So I think that's a way of promoting or encouraging that behavior. But we'll see the test of time. So keep your morals and your morale high. This is 7th Generation Warfare. I'm your current host, John Nelson, and in this episode we looked at physical, moral, and mental forces.